The Vietnam War was a conflict primarily between North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States and other anti-communist allies. It was rooted in the post-colonial struggle for national liberation and was also deeply entangled in Cold War dynamics as a proxy war between communist and anti-communist forces. The key issue was North Vietnam's goal to unify all of Vietnam under a communist regime, while South Vietnam, supported by the U.S., aimed to prevent the spread of communism in the region. The war began after Vietnam had been divided into North and South Vietnam, following the defeat of the French colonial forces in 1954. North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese Communist Party, supplied and directed the Viet Cong guerrilla fighters in the South. The U.S. escalated its involvement from the early 1960s to full military engagement by 1965, fearing the domino theory that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Southeast Asia would follow. The war included intense combat, heavy bombing campaigns, and significant civilian and military casualties. It ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, and Vietnam was reunified under communist control. The economic causes of the Vietnam War include several interconnected factors: economic aid and Cold War rivalry. The Cold War rivalry between the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union and China, played a major role economically. The U.S. provided substantial financial support to the capitalist South Vietnam to build a prosperous alternative to communist North Vietnam. Conversely, the Soviet Union and China supplied economic aid to North Vietnam to sustain its war effort and economy during the conflict. Economic challenges and inequality in South Vietnam. Despite U.S. aid, South Vietnam experienced major economic challenges. A small elite controlled most arable land, and ineffective land reforms led to widespread dissatisfaction among rural populations, which fueled support for the communist Viet Cong, who promised land redistribution. The South Vietnamese economy was highly dependent on American aid, making it unstable and highly susceptible to corruption. Strain on U.S. economy. The escalating U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War resulted in substantial financial burdens. Increased military spending, without correlating tax increases, led to rising inflation and budget deficits in the U.S. government. Wartime expenditures also diverted money away from social programs, aggravating economic instability domestically. The war caused widespread destruction of infrastructure, agricultural land, and industrial facilities throughout Vietnam, especially in the north. This devastated the Vietnamese economy and required large financial and labor resources for reconstruction, further complicating economic conditions. After the war, Vietnam adopted a planned economy with nationalization and collectivization, but faced severe economic difficulties, including low productivity, supply imbalances, inflation, and corruption. The war's destruction and loss of skilled workers handicapped the country's economic recovery. The economic interest of the USA in the Vietnam War primarily involved maintaining high levels of military spending, which kept corporate profits strong and unemployment low, particularly benefiting defense contractors producing weapons and military technology. The economic benefits were unevenly distributed, with companies producing specific war-related equipment, such as helicopters, gaining significantly. Additionally, the U.S. aimed to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, which was seen as critical to protecting broader geopolitical and economic interests during the Cold War era. The U.S. also invested heavily in South Vietnam to build infrastructure and modernize the country, reflecting an economic as well as strategic interest in sustaining an anti-communist regime there. Overall, while economic interests included defense industry profits and military spending stimulus, these came alongside significant economic costs, including inflation and reduced funding for social programs at home, and a substantial outlay in support of South Vietnam's regime and economy. The American military intervention in Vietnam had significant and complex impacts on the local economy and local energetic resources. The war caused widespread destruction of infrastructure, which disrupted local commerce and economic development. Intense bombing campaigns destroyed physical infrastructure such as bridges, power plants, oil storage, and even classrooms, which hindered commercial activities and human capital accumulation. Populations were displaced, leading to a reduction in local economic activity, although many people eventually returned. Despite the heavy destruction, evidence suggests that heavily bombed areas did not fall into persistent poverty traps due to subsequent state investment and recovery efforts in the post-war period. Vietnam experienced moderate negative effects on consumption levels in the short run, but faster growth emerged in the following years, indicating a catch-up process economically. The U.S. military spending during the war also had inflationary effects and economic distortions. Wartime spending kept corporate profits high and unemployment low in the U.S., but also caused inflation and diverted funds that could have supported social programs, indirectly affecting economic stability in Vietnam as well. The American bombing campaigns notably targeted energetic infrastructure. For example, U.S. bombing wiped out about 65% of North Vietnam's oil storage capacity and 59% of its power plants, deeply damaging the country's energy resources. This destruction not only limited immediate energy availability, but also slowed recovery and economic activities dependent on energy. The impact of commercial interests on U.S. military strategy in the Vietnam War was intertwined with broader geopolitical and ideological motivations rather than being a primary driver. The U.S. strategy was largely shaped by Cold War imperatives, especially the containment of communism, fears of a communist domino effect in Asia, and national prestige concerns. The military approach was multifaceted, focusing on containing the communist North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, supporting the South Vietnamese government, and attempting to stabilize the region politically and socially. Commercial interests, such as economic benefits for American industries or corporate profit motives, do not appear as central drivers in the official military strategy or escalation decisions. Instead, military and political leaders prioritized Cold War ideological goals and strategic calculations, including preventing the spread of communism and maintaining U.S. global credibility. The military strategy was one of graduated escalation, restrained use of force to avoid broader conflict with China or the Soviet Union, and a comprehensive effort to build a non-communist state in South Vietnam. However, the war effort did involve substantial defense spending that benefited the military-industrial complex in the U.S., with large contracts for weapons production and military logistics. The economic impacts on the U.S. economy and industries, along with the war-related political and social costs domestically, were significant. Yet, these commercial interests were more consequences of the war effort, rather than direct influences shaping the initial U.S. military strategy in Vietnam. The Vietnam War in numbers includes significant data on military personnel, casualties, and deaths from various involved parties. Total U.S. military personnel involved. Approximately 2,594,000 served in country during the war, including 1,736,000 in the Army, 391,000 Marines, and 293,000 airmen. U.S. casualties. About 58,220 U.S. military deaths, including 47,378 killed in action, KIA, with an additional 10,824 non-hostile deaths. There were also 304,704 wounded in action and 2,338 missing in action. South Vietnamese Armed Forces, estimated 223,748 killed in action and over 1,169,763 wounded. North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong, estimated around 1,100,000 killed and 600,000 wounded. Civilian deaths, Vietnam, both North and South. Estimates range from 405,000 to over 2 million depending on sources, with total war-related Vietnamese deaths estimated between 791,000 to over 3 million, including military and civilians. Other Allied forces casualties. South Korea had 4,407 killed, Australia 469, Thailand 351, and New Zealand 55 killed. Total deaths, including civilians and combatants, range widely, with estimates of Vietnamese deaths from about 970,000 to 3 million, plus over 58,000 U.S. deaths and additional deaths among Cambodians and Laotians. The financial cost of the U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War is generally estimated to be around $168 billion in direct government expenditure. Some estimates rounding higher suggest up to approximately $352 billion according to official government reports, while private economists estimate the total cost could be double or even triple that amount when broader economic and social costs are included. In current dollar terms, adjusted for inflation, the cost has been noted as roughly $738 billion. The war's expenses also led to large federal budget deficits and limited domestic programs. The war spending contributed to large federal budget deficits and diverted funds from domestic programs like Johnson's Great Society. Beyond direct costs, intangible and indirect costs, such as veteran care and economic disruption, increased the total financial burden. Military spending during the peak years, 1965 to 1969, soared, with spending peaking at around $85 billion per year in 1969. The Vietnam War was primarily financed through a combination of loans and taxes, with a significant portion coming from loans. Around 80% of the war costs were financed by loans, mostly domestic debt, while about 20% was covered by taxation. The war began with a tax cut, reflecting political decisions at the time, but as the conflict escalated, tax increases did occur to help cover costs. The national debt increased substantially during the war, reaching about $151.4 billion. The financing strategy contrasted with earlier wars that relied more heavily on taxes or other methods. Inflation also rose during the Vietnam era, influenced by the mix of financing methods and economic policies of the period. Taxes initially were cut at the beginning of the Vietnam War, reflecting political considerations, particularly the desire to avoid undermining domestic programs. Tax increases were implemented later in the war, serving to support and partially finance the escalating costs. The goal was to spread the burden more equitably, but tax revenue only covered about 20% of the total war expenditure. Loans constituted the majority, about 80%, of financing for the Vietnam War. Domestic borrowing was the primary source, contributing to a substantial rise in national debt. The U.S. government issued debt instruments to finance the war effort without immediate taxation impact. The deficit financing approach contributed to inflation during the Vietnam War period. The government's reliance on loans allowed postponing tax burdens, but created long-term fiscal pressure. This combination of loans and taxes, with heavy reliance on borrowing, shaped the economic and political landscape during the Vietnam War. It was a different approach from World War II or the Korean War, where more taxes were used upfront to finance war expenditures. Beyond the immediate war budget, the U.S. faced enormous indirect costs, including long-term veterans' health care, disability compensation, and treating the lasting health impacts of Agent Orange exposure. The war significantly strained the U.S. economy by fueling inflation, expanding federal budget deficits in the 1960s and 1970s, and limiting funding for domestic programs. Social upheaval and political divisions related to the war effort also had economic implications. Environmental damage through Agent Orange and unexploded ordnance caused long-term economic and humanitarian consequences in the region. The Vietnam War's effects on current global economic policy are indirect but significant, especially when considering Vietnam's economic development and integration into the global economy today. The devastation and economic disruption caused by the Vietnam War set the stage for Vietnam's post-war economic reforms, known as Doi Moi, launched in 1986. These reforms transitioned Vietnam from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented model, setting Vietnam on a path of rapid economic growth, increased foreign investment, and global trade integration. The war's aftermath compelled Vietnam to innovate economically and pursue export-driven growth as a survival strategy, shaping its today's role in global supply chains. Vietnam's historical experience, shaped by the costs of war and post-war rebuilding, has made it highly sensitive to global trade dynamics and tariffs. In 2025, Vietnam faces significant economic challenges linked to new U.S. tariffs on Vietnamese exports, signaling how lingering geopolitical tensions reminiscent of Cold War rivalries continue to influence global economic policies. Vietnam's strategic responses to trade conflicts embody lessons from its history of overcoming external economic pressures while seeking to sustain growth and development. The global economic costs of the Vietnam War, particularly for the United States, were enormous and multifaceted. The Vietnam War indirectly influenced the evolution of global economic policies by shaping U.S. economic priorities and military spending during the Cold War era, which affected inflation, public debt, and monetary policies. Moreover, the war influenced U.S. and allied nations' approach to foreign aid and economic engagement with developing countries during the post-war period, which can be traced in global economic approaches to conflict regions today. The Vietnam War's economic consequences prompted structural reforms in Vietnam that underpin its current economic resilience and global integration. The legacy also influences contemporary trade disputes and global economic policies, showing how historical conflicts shape current economic diplomacy and trade strategies globally. Beyond direct costs, intangible and indirect costs, such as veteran care and economic disruption, increased the total financial burden. The U.S. faced enormous indirect costs, including long-term veterans' health care, disability compensation, and treating the lasting health impacts of Agent Orange exposure. The war significantly strained the U.S. economy by fueling inflation, expanding federal budget deficits in the 1960s and 1970s, and limiting funding for domestic programs like President Johnson's Great Society reforms. Social upheaval and political divisions related to the war effort also had economic implications. The Vietnamese population suffered millions of casualties and widespread infrastructure destruction amid heavy aerial bombings and chemical defoliation. Environmental damage through Agent Orange and unexploded ordnance caused long-term economic and humanitarian consequences in the region. The Vietnam War's effects on current global economic policy are indirect but significant, especially when considering Vietnam's economic development and integration into the global economy today. Vietnam's historical experience, shaped by the costs of war and post-war rebuilding, has made it highly sensitive to global trade dynamics and tariffs. In 2025, Vietnam faces significant economic challenges linked to new U.S. tariffs on Vietnamese exports, signaling how lingering geopolitical tensions reminiscent of Cold War rivalries continue to influence global economic policies. Vietnam's strategic responses to trade conflicts embody lessons from its history of overcoming external economic pressures while seeking to sustain growth and development. The Vietnam War indirectly influenced the evolution of global economic policies by shaping U.S. economic priorities and military spending during the Cold War era, which affected inflation, public debt, and monetary policies. Moreover, the war influenced U.S. and allied nations' approach to foreign aid and economic engagement with developing countries during the post-war period, which can be traced in global economic approaches to conflict regions today. In conclusion, the Vietnam War's economic consequences prompted structural reforms in Vietnam that underpin its current economic resilience and global integration. The legacy also influences contemporary trade disputes and global economic policies, showing how historical conflicts shape current economic diplomacy and trade strategies globally.